Hello and welcome to another knitting video from me. I have a lot on my mind today, which is not surprising. This channel is called The Danish Musings. So there's always thoughts to be had and words to be expressed. First of all, I want to thank you for showing up. If I show up and you don't, there's no point in me making these videos. So thank you so much for that. And also for your engagement, however big or small that it is. I appreciate it so much. My name is Helle, or Hella, and I have to show you this. This is ridiculous. My name in English is usually pronounced Hella, as if it's written with an A at the end. And often, if I tell people how it's pronounced, they will write it Hella. And then, not so long ago, I found out that La Bien-Aimée has a color called Hella. Do you see it? I just kind of love that. I also think it's interesting that it's this color because it's not actually a color that I gravitate to, but I have to say it's worming its way slowly into my surroundings, so that's interesting. But it's not going to be part of this particular video, apart from this, the name, which I love. As you know, probably, I'm coming to you from Denmark, and whether you're a new viewer or a so-called old viewer of these so far 4 to 5 knitting videos, I appreciate you being here. I wanted to start before today's full episode. I wanted to start with a little quote. It's extremely small. It's only 2 words, and it's from one of my favorite books ever, Howard's End by E.M. Forster, who was one of my first loves in English literature. Him and Jane Austen came at around the same time when I was like 19, and they stayed there for many, many years. Howard's End is a special favorite of mine, and I love the movie as well, especially because Emma Thompson is in it. Anyway, I digress. It's way too early to digress, but this book has a tiny quote in the beginning, and the quote is, "Only connect." And Forster meant it in a way where you connect with things in life, or you connect things in life that are seemingly opposites, or you connect things that are far apart. It could be, for instance, in his world, intellectuals and artists. It could also be upper class or middle class people and working class people. So, the coming together is what I take it to mean. And that's why I wanted to begin with it today, because there's so much connection being created here, and I love it so much. And I know that on your end, it may feel very small because you're just one person watching this or writing, if you do, and it may not feel like a connection, but it still is, because every time you watch this, it means something to me. If you've commented, it means, of course, even more. And I so appreciate it. And I feel it's a kind of mutual enrichment. I can only do so much. I really depend on you being there. And for that, I thank you. I also just wanted to mention something briefly that I saw somebody else mention on a podcast. I forget who. Sorry. But somebody said that when she posts a video, that's her beginning a conversation. And then if you take it up and comment on it, that's you taking part in that conversation. Which means that I will perhaps initiate it, and then you might answer or share or whatever. So I don't necessarily have to reply back. And I think, I'm not trying to excuse why I can't answer every single comment, but it does make sense. And one viewer wrote, I thought that was just perfect. You don't have to reply to everything. We'd rather just have you knit. I thought that was lovely. So that's what I'm going to do to some extent. But I will also try to answer as much as I can. And for sure, I read every single comment. I deeply appreciate every single comment. So thank you so much. And finally, I just want to say, usually when you watch knitting videos, the viewer will tend to go, oh, I've added that and that to my knitting queue now. In this case, it was me adding things to my queue, because so many of you wrote back to suggest things I could knit with, either the brushed alpaca or the drops air or other suggestions. So thank you so much for that. It's very inspiring for me as well. And above all, I thank you for the vote of confidence that it is to show up for anybody's video and for perhaps subscribing or commenting. It truly means so much. Now let's get into what this is actually all about. So, what am I wearing? I'm wearing the Sarang sweater. So, I'll insert a little video of where I'm wearing it so you can see how it drapes and the way it looks. The sarang comes in 3 sizes, with the chest circumference ranging from 120 to 140 centimeters or 47 to 55 inches. It's got these little bamboo buttons, which I think is such a lovely detail. As you know, if you've seen my previous video where I was actually, well, 2/3 of the way done with it, I'd just begun the second sleeve. It's a pattern by Knit, a Danish design team consisting of mother and daughter who actually live about 7 kilometers from me. I love the design. I think it's so beautiful. I'll just get up. So as I mentioned before, it consists of all over cables in these panels with a middle lace panel. It's romantic, but it's also modern in its boxy shape. And I, for one, haven't seen, how you can combine the cables with the lace. And I really like that. It did take a while to knit, of course, because there are cables everywhere. I use a cable needle. And it's on 4 millimeter, and this part is on 3.5 millimeter. I think 4 is 6, US 6. But so what? It certainly invites mindfulness along the way. And for me, it was a mix between a process and a product knit. I really enjoyed knitting it, but I also really wanted the finished object. And I learned new things in this, which I always think is interesting. I learned to make these welts. I even asked on Instagram what they were called. In Danish, bise. And a lot of people wrote to say that it was called a welt. In that connection, some of you who wrote to tell me, your replies were hidden behind some kind of wall on Instagram that I didn't know was there. So a lot of people have sent messages to me, and it took me sometimes a week to reply because I didn't know it was there. It was only thanks to a Polish viewer called Liliana. So thank you, Liliana, for letting me know that you have to accept these messages. And in that, when I had clicked on that, I found all these messages most of them telling me that it's called a welt. A few suggested other words, so there may be other words, but I went with the majority vote, which was also what I'd seen before in another project, so I assumed that was the word, but I wasn't sure. And anyway, about it taking a long time, of course you could make a sweater in no time at all if you just knit in pure stockinette. And we all know that knitting is not necessarily a speedy habit anyway, and nor is it meant to be. So I think from the beginning I accepted that this was going to take a little while. As I think I talked about, you had to concentrate when you began it. Now I forget how. I think you began from the back and then you made your way onto the shoulders and then you knit it flat until you joined under the sleeves here. And so it was simple. It wasn't, there are a lot of pages because there are a lot of steps to the shaping, but the cables themselves, they take care of themselves basically. Once you get down here, you just keep on going. And the same with the sleeves, you don't decrease until you're here. So that's just pure sort of relatively mindless knitting, if you will. One of the things I did was for the lace panel, I definitely had to stay focused. So that was not mindless knitting, but very mindful knitting. A lace panel like this, you need to make sure that they align because it's over, I guess, 6 rows or something like that. I forget. 6 rows up and then 10 stitches across. So I put stitch markers between the 10 stitches. Otherwise, I would probably have messed up. That way I memorized the pattern repeat and didn't have to expend extra energy focusing on whether or not I was in the correct place. So I have to say that's helpful. And it's not cheating. It's one of the things you can do to help yourself. A small digression. And another thing I'm working on, I used stitch markers for that as well. I'll show you in a little while. But I used the little light bulb ones because I had to be able to take them out. And suddenly I used them all up. And I know I had more to begin with. Every time I finish a project, it's as if I have fewer stitch markers than when I began it. And it seems to me that it's sort of like when you do your laundry and you wash socks. There's a certain loss of socks. Every now and then you pull out one sock and the other one isn't there. And over the years, you just seem to lose socks. At least I do. I don't know if this is universal, but the same goes for stitch markers. I lose stitch markers gradually. At the rate I'm going, I expect in about a year I'll have 5 left or so. And I began with this little box. What are they called? Cocoa knits. And there aren't that many left now, which is surprising considering I've only got one project on my needles that uses them. 1.5, which I'll get to later. Okay, getting back to the Sarang sweater here. I love how it's different from most other patterns I've seen recently, certainly. And I love that it's romantic, but not overly so. And let me just show you the yarns one more time, though I did show them in the last video. It's Biche et Bûche in this pale pink. Is it coming up? Which has like off-white undertones in it. And it's Le Cashmere and lambswool, and then held with Le Petit Silk and Mohair in nude pink, which is kind of a beigey powder color with just a tiny hint of pink. They have one that's slightly more pink, that's more over in this color if you wanted to make it a slightly more pink. What I really like about this is that it was partly a challenge to knit. Although, as I said, some of it was actually really simple and easy. But the challenge bit was sort of, getting to the different sections and make a little slit here for the buttons. But I think, every time you're challenged, it makes it that much more interesting to actually finish and succeed with the project. And I think it's also nice to challenge yourself every now and then. And probably since I made this, it was all the more appreciated when the next thing I knitted on was a little more simple. So I do tend to go back and forth between that. I'm a Libra, so I'm all about balance, Challenge, easy. Challenge, easy. Or for that matter, neutral, pop of color. Neutral, pop of color. Sometimes neutral, until pop of color. And that's fine, If you like stockinette, and that's what you enjoy, that's what you should go for. Of course, as I've said before, and as I think we all say, it should be a joy. You're doing it for you. And also, this is very sort of muted and delicate and feminine, and sometimes I really like that. As you'll see in my next finished sweater, sometimes I like something that's completely different. And I think it also depends on where we are in life. Sometimes we need something that's warm and cozy and comfortable. Other times we may want to go for something that's a little more risky or cool or hip. And other times, again, we may not even care that much about what it's going to look like. We just need a certain something to be knitting on. And I think also I don't want the same type of sweater all the time in my closet, although there will always be a fair amount of cables. I love cables. But it's nice to have different knitting experiences and also different learning experiences, which is what I'm going to get to more and more in this video. For me, I like learning something new in every sweater. It may not be something major every time, but just, knowing that I progress and that I no longer feel so fearful about going for certain projects, that in itself is also quite gratifying, I find. Oh, and one more thing. When you bind off, as you can perhaps see here, you bind off closing the welt. So that's sort of neat. And here you bind off using just a regular bind off. Having now bound off many times using an Italian sewn bind off, suddenly, you've gone through all this complicated stuff and you bind off normally. That was sort of, I could appreciate that. That the bind off didn't take extra time. And I've already gotten quite a bit of wear out of it. I think, interestingly, even though it looks like some kind of statement piece, I've worn it with wide pants and I've worn it with jeans. And I think you can, it's wearable. The only thing that's a little tricky is that you can't necessarily get the sleeves into very sort of coats with very narrow sleeves. But you know, a lot of modern sweaters are like that. Maybe you should get a different coat instead of avoiding certain knitting patterns, I find, or a separate coat. One more thing, if you're considering knitting this but you think that it's too boxy or too oversized, what you can do is you can pick up fewer stitches under the sleeves there when you pick up for the sleeves, as long as you make sure that the number fits the cables and the lace pattern beneath. I haven't tried, obviously, but you need to make sure that it fits the cables underneath. And something that I also want to say about this is that it's really necessary to block it. I haven't tried steam blocking. I don't even have one of those steamers. I don't know if they exist in Denmark. But I washed it and blocked it. I wouldn't say aggressively because I didn't stretch it, but I put pins in. And I put pins in many places where the welts were so that they would sort of fold down neatly. And also it made the lace really just sort of neat and flat and even. And the same with the cables. So it's definitely one of those sweaters that you need to block. Okay, moving on to my next finished object, which is by the same designer, and I told you about it, I think, last time. And it's the Bowie sweater. It looks like this. I'll insert footage of me wearing it so you can see how it fits, how it drapes. The Bowie comes in two sizes, where the smallest is 145 centimeters wide and the largest is 155 centimeters wide, which is about 61 inches. I have to say I couldn't love it more. I knit the sample sweater of it in Især tweed and silk mohair back in, I want to say, November or something like that. And I really loved the fit and the model, and I knew already then I wanted one for myself. And it took me a while to figure out what yarn, because I wanted still to have yarn that was that had flex in it. So as I mentioned, I used Puno from the Danish brand Gepardgarn. Oops. And it's perfect. It's so perfect. Okay, so I just changed in order not just to have it shown. And I don't know if you can tell the fit even here. I love the kind of funnel neck, and I love how the ribbing continues from the shoulders down, and the drop shoulder. Yeah, it's just, I love it so much. And the yarn is soft. I've yet to find out if I'm gonna break out in a rash from it. You never know with me and my skin. But so far, it's incredibly soft, and I love the yarn with this design. And I also think it's interesting because in this kind of sweater, it's like I at once feel like it's very in fashion with the oversized chunky look, and at the same time beyond fashion, if you know what I mean. It's just, it's its own thing. I made one modification here, which I could only make because I had already knitted it once before, and that's when you make the shoulders and you increase along either side of this shoulder ribbing here. And when you do that, you of course make the body wider. And I think in the sample that I knitted, it was maybe this much wider in each side. And I felt my frame was maybe just a tiny bit too small for that. Although Caroline's frame, the designer, she's actually smaller. And she looks cool in it, but then she looks cool in everything. Although I have seen people who look similar to me wear something that's really huge, so, and it looks good on them. Maybe it's because of my height. Or maybe it's something else. I don't know. But for me, I wanted it just a tad narrower. And although this is by no means narrow, it is still slightly narrower. So I just stopped increasing at some point. And then when I picked up here around the sleeve, I then knitted the sleeve a little longer than what it said in the pattern, so that it would still have the required length, and it has just the length that I like. And this was a gratifying knit after I'd knitted Sarang. For one thing, there's a lot of just stockinette. And by the way, this is the side that I knitted. So it's knit stitches. And then you turn it over. So it's reverse stockinette. Once you've made the collar and you begin increasing, etc. It's a simple knit. It's relatively easy, I would say. And it's on size 6mm needles, which is US 10. So it's a quick knit because it's also bulky weight. I think it's bulky weight. At least it's 110 meters in a 50-gram ball of yarn. So I think that's bulky. I wouldn't say it flew off my needles because nothing flies off my needles. And the reason why I mention that is that it's one of those phrases I hear mentioned in many podcasts. Oh, this flew off my needles. And I'm like, nothing flies off my needles. I spend hours on the couch, on my butt, knitting things. Even if it's a fast knit compared to something that isn't, it's still hours and hours. And I feel that. The reason why I also mention that is that I think if you're a beginning knitter or if you're a relatively slow knitter like me, you may feel, nothing flies off my needles. And you may think you're doing something wrong, or you may feel envy that for other people things fly off their needles. Well, I can just tell you that it doesn't fly. Nothing flies off my needles. It takes hours. I also brought it with me when I went to New York, as I mentioned, and I knitted on it on the plane and on the train and at the airport. And it's a perfect travel knit because you don't have to think, you don't have to look at the pattern or a chart all the time. But the yarn itself was maybe a little fluffy. I think I saw slight strands sort of flying in the air on the plane. This time I had my family sitting next to me, so it didn't matter all that much. But ideally, I should perhaps not have had a yarn like that with me. But it didn't matter. It worked fine. And also, it didn't weigh very much. And another thing, I brought wooden knitting needles with me. I'll show them a little later because somebody actually asked. And I've heard that wooden needles you're more likely to be allowed to bring wooden knitting needles with you on a plane than metal knitting needles. I think because, when your bag is put through security, that screen doesn't pick up that you've got needles in your bag. And I think it does if they're made of metal. And you might be not allowed to bring them. So definitely have another pair in your suitcase, just in case. Just before I get into my whips, what's currently on my needles, I want to say something that's like an addendum to something I mentioned in my last video. And I think in there I said something a little clumsily, to be honest. I mentioned how it wasn't so interesting to me to follow people who only test knit. And I don't even know why I said it that way, because it sounds harsh maybe. And I certainly didn't want to offend anybody or hurt anybody's feelings, because if you love to test knit, go for it. I don't want to contribute with any sort of criticism in the world. We've got enough of that all around us all the time. I think what I meant to express is that once I found somebody to follow or subscribe to or whatever, to be inspired by, I'm really wanting to know what sort of patterns that person would pick if it was completely up to them. I'm curious immediately. So it was, for me, it's, I guess, a desire to see more of who that person is. I'm not sure what I mean exactly, but there's a difference between promotion and inspiration. For me, I feel I have a different sensation in my body when I watch somebody who promotes something because they love it and something they promote because it's a job. And even if it is a job, still fine, that's completely okay. As my daughter says all the time, you do you, live and let live. That is certainly my motto. I mean, so many people, and in this case, including me, are so busy commenting on or having an opinion about what others should do. And we shouldn't. We should just let others do what they want and send love their way and be fine about that. I'm very much a believer in that quote that's been flying around for the past few years. In a world where you can be anything, be kind, so show up with kindness. And I'm so sorry if I didn't do that well enough. You live and you learn. So I hope you'll forgive me if that hurt anybody's feelings. If you don't hurt other people's feelings, do absolutely whatever you want if it sparks joy in you. Another reason why I may have talked about it that way is there's a chance that I was projecting. I can't rule that out. Anytime we judge other people or even have any tiny opinion, we can invite ourselves to look inside. Is there something here that I'm projecting onto this person? And you can never rule that out. And for me, I remember going on Instagram about a year ago, a little over a year ago, and finding this whole big knitting community and feeling intimidated by some of it. And this is segueing into the beginning knitter bit about this video, because a few people have written to me, and I thank you so much for that vote of confidence, to say that they're beginning knitters and they're now slowly beginning to knit things. But I've also received comments by people who are not beginning knitters, but who have mainly knitted accessories and who have felt, and this is the word they chose, intimidated by sweaters and knitting garments. And I really wanted to address that because I can completely understand. I was there. I didn't maybe feel intimidated by the whole sweater thing, but by the amount of sweaters that people were apparently knitting, by all the test knitting bit. This is where that was coming from. By just realizing how big the whole knitting community had become in the past few years. I had to take the sweater off for a little while. If there's one thing that can be said for these sweaters, it's that they're warm. And the sun's out now, so my living room is pretty warm. And when I started watching knitting podcasts and seeing projects on Instagram, I was blown away. Then somebody in a knitting podcast would say, and then I cast on with a provisional cast on, and I did some mosaic knitting here, and I did some short rows there. And then I did a Latvian braid, and I bound off with this really fancy bind off. And I would just stare and think, what are they talking about? That freaked me out a little, and I was a bit intimidated. How I chose to perceive it, and I talked about comparison also in a previous video, instead of comparison being something like, she's better than me, or I can't measure up, maybe we can use comparison as incentive so that it becomes like, oh, if she can do that, I can too. Remember what Pippi Longstocking said. Actually, she said the opposite. She said, I haven't tried that before, so I'm sure I can do it. And it was a steep learning curve for me in the beginning. I Googled and I went on YouTube and I did all sorts of things to find out how to do stuff. And the reason why I did that is that I refused to begin just knitting dishcloths or mittens that nobody would use. I love mittens, but you should do it if you want to. You should knit mittens or hats or cowls or sweaters or socks, blankets, whatever makes you happy, whatever you wish to have. Don't let it stop you because it's something you haven't tried before. I would suggest that you start, if you can knit and you can purl and you've learned to increase and decrease and cast on and bind off, those are the basics that you can learn by watching videos on YouTube. If you can do that, you can knit a sweater. But what you do is you begin with sweaters that don't require all sorts of fancy stuff, and then you take it from there. So choose a pattern that you think, I actually would like this finished garment, instead of practicing on lots of things that you think are necessary in order for you to progress to a sweater. Don't think you're not worthy of knitting a sweater or smart enough or skilled enough or advanced enough, because you will be. You will learn incrementally with each project. Then what you can do is then you finish one sweater that's maybe relatively simple but basic and classic, and you have that and it's gratifying. And then you can say to yourself, okay, next time I won't be intimidated by a pattern that requires short rows or cables or something else. And you will make mistakes along the way. I've made mistakes, I think, in every project. And just as an example, I wanted to show you a mistake I made when I made the Clint Classic sweater by Anne Wenzel. It's a beautiful sweater, but if you look at this sleeve right here, you can see that looks decidedly weird. And the reason why it's weird is that this was only my second sweater after I'd begun knitting again. It was describing something, and suddenly it said, turn. Turn. That's all it said. Knit, blah, 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 then turn. And I'm going, turn? There was a minute there where I thought, turn? I honestly didn't know what the pattern meant. And so I just turned. I didn't turn it upside down, but I just turned, and I didn't do the whole German short row thing that you're supposed to. It said something about picking up the two legs, blah, blah. I'm like, what does that mean? So I didn't figure that out until the following sweater, where I did actually go on YouTube, because I didn't realize that it was more advanced than what I thought it was. So, you can tell there's a little jog on each sleeve, on either side of the short rows. Oh well, you live and you learn, and that's my whole point here. I think if we want to be able to pursue whatever knitting pattern we want and knit whatever we want, we have to accept that there's going to be mistakes. And I also think we should be sort of brave enough to embrace new skills, new techniques, and maybe try to cultivate curiosity rather than fear. And I remember back when I was a teacher, I had a psychology colleague who told us about this concept of mastering, in Danish, mestring, which means that you master something, and it takes practice, and you will make mistakes, and it takes time and patience and the willingness to be wrong and to make mistakes. But when you do that, when you accept all that, you will become better at whatever it is you do. You will gain more confidence. We can only build confidence by mastering things, not by avoiding them. So go for the sweaters. No matter how intimidated you are, be brave. And of course, make sure that you maybe don't climb, up more steps, but take it, a little at a time, but maybe more than what you think you can. And, you'll learn along the way. I think I watched Anne Wenzel's video about Italian bind-off maybe 15 times for my first sweater. And look at this bind-off. I mean, I love this bind-off. So it was definitely worth the time. Then I watched it again maybe 15 more times for my next sweater until suddenly my hands had it memorized. And that's what it's like. It's not something that flies off your needles or, wow, you are a fast knitter. There's a lot of steps in there that you don't necessarily see. So if you can accept that that's part of the game, you can definitely knit sweaters, advanced sweaters even. And if I don't use the Italian binder for the next 6 months, I can guarantee you I will have to go back to the video come winter again to rewatch it. And I'm just grateful that the videos are there at all. And also, curiosity can take us to many interesting places, not just in knitting, whereas fear gets us nowhere. I'm not talking about the good fear, where we're afraid of something that's potentially dangerous, but the fear that inhibits us from trying things out. I'll go back to talking about some of the things that I think should be said to beginning or intimidated knitters, but let me just first talk a little bit about my whips. And it's very much connected to some of what I just said. As you may know, if you've seen my previous video, you'll know that I'm knitting the snow crocus. This looks pretty beautiful, doesn't it? However, I have to rip it out. I'm not sure what I did wrong, and everything was going swimmingly, I thought. And even if you notice this, I've got this system where I have not only stitch markers between repeats, but I've put little letters on here because Midori Hiroshi's pattern it's not difficult per se, but it's extremely detailed. The problem is that for me is that all the sizes just sort of continue. It's not like size small, size medium, size first medium, second medium. They're not together. You have to switch back and forth, so that for the first section I chose to go for a size M2 because I wanted it slightly a little baggy. And I found out because you know how one of those things that everybody tells you to do is to measure your favorite sweater or the sweater that you like the fit of for a certain sweater. I don't want the same fit for every sweater. And this one was maybe somewhere between my C2 sweater by Helga Isa and my Abba sweater by Aegyo Knit. So I found out I probably wanted to knit the M2 size. But for the first part of the M2 size, I had to follow the extra small. Then after that, I had to follow the M1 size. So, you switch back and forth between these different pages. And somewhere along the way, I must have made a mistake because the next time I had to make a row, I could see that I was in the wrong part of the pattern. So it looks right to me, but it's not. So I have to rip it all the way up to here. It doesn't look like this took hours, but it did. And for some of it, I was on the plane. But it's okay. I think I've made my peace with that because this is very much a process knit. Although, of course, I would love the finished object. I'm also still excited about knitting one of her patterns because it's so intricate and detailed, and I like the whole Japanese thoroughness of it. So one of these days, when I've come to terms with the fact that I made a mistake somewhere, I'm going to have to rip it back and start over and be more mindful. I thought I was mindful, but apparently not. So that's where I am with that. Somebody asked me about the yarn that I used for it, and I think I had shown it in a previous episode, but I'll just show you again. This is the purple, and this is the apple mint green. So it's a Japanese brand called Mominoki. It's hand-dyed in Germany, but the name surely is Japanese. And I absolutely love the combination. I love the design, and I love the neck here. It's kind of similar to the Bowie sweater neck. It's like a funnel neck. I really love it. And I think I'm going to love it when I'm finished with it. But I also think that it's probably going to be a little sort of on the back burner for a while. Something I'm just going to knit on continually for a while now, whilst moving slowly into more springy knits, which I'll talk about in my next video, I think. I may just broach it here briefly. Something else that was tricky here was that, for the first time for me anyways, that I had to do cables on the wrong side. I don't think I've ever tried that before. Maybe it was on the sleeve or here. So, you know, there are many new things and many repeats, so that's tricky. But I think I'll stop talking about this in my videos until I'm significantly further in the process, because otherwise it's one of those things that keep on showing up and you're like, she hasn't knitted any further on it. It's kind of not so helpful, or that's not so inspiring. So I think that may have to last all summer. And I'm determined. For a while there I was a little sort of deflated about it, but I'm determined to crack the code and to figure it out. It's very satisfying once you do that, apropos what I mentioned before. Okay, and my other whip, this time it's barely a whip. I have to say, I'm almost embarrassed to show you. This is as far as I've gotten. Yeah, I have it on these barber wires because I had to bring it with me yesterday. And the reason why I haven't, this is the Seon kimono by Aimee Knit. And the reason why I'm not any further along with it is that when the test knit began, I was still knitting the last sleeve of my Sarang, and then I was going to New York City, where I was bringing the Bowie sweater. You don't bring a test knit where you will have millions of questions on a plane, of course. So I was knitting on them, and then I saw gradually so many comments came from the test knitters, and I thought, that's too overwhelming for me. I don't have excess brain power to expend on that while I'm also traveling and finishing the last sleeve on the Sarang and knitting the Bowie. So I put it on pause for a minute, and then when I came back home, I wanted to pick it up again, and Caroline from Aimee Knit was just updating the pattern. So I've been waiting eagerly for that, and I can't wait to get properly underway with this pattern because I love the kimono. It's so beautiful, and I love the combination of the yarns. I've talked about it before. The trio, the Isea trio and the silk mohair, and this lovely blush combination, which yields this particular swatch. If I'm further along with this before I edit and put up the video, I'll insert some footage of how far I've gotten. But this is definitely one of those spring knits that I can't wait to knit, because it's just a very beautiful and relaxed kimono. So I'm looking forward to knitting on that. And again, I will not post another video before I'm done with the Seon kimono. So that's out there now. Okay, if I can just get back to some of the things I wanted to say to beginning knitters, or any knitters for that matter, people who feel slightly intimidated, and also maybe something to designers here, because there's so much talk these days about size inclusivity, rightly so, but I think that conversation should be expanded to skill inclusivity. What I mean by that is that I heard somebody say that she doesn't necessarily like, if somebody on a podcast, she doesn't necessarily like patterns to be very detailed. she'd like to figure things out for herself. And I can understand that. I like that too, because it's gratifying and it's satisfying when you figure things out. But any sweater pattern is potentially somebody's first pattern. And you can easily become demotivated and discouraged if you knit something where not only is it maybe a tricky pattern, but things aren't explained that could be explained. And one of the things that I'd like to compare it with is, I was a teacher for many years, and there's this concept in teaching called førfagligt sprog, and that means, literally speaking, means pre-subject related language. An example could be a student in the 4th grade is given a math assignment where he has to measure the angle of a staircase. And that's fair enough. Angle is maybe explained in the classroom because that's a math term. But staircase isn't explained because it's assumed everybody knows what a staircase is. If this is a child who grew up in a country where Danish was not his first language and he has moved to Denmark, or anybody in Denmark, or any country for that matter, whose first language is something other than the main language spoken in that country, may not necessarily have the same background knowledge that the assignment assumes you have. So if this is a child who grew up in a village where there were flat houses, he has grown up and only seen flat one-story houses, he might not know what a staircase is. And a staircase, it's not math related. It's just something that the makers of that assignment assume everybody knows. The same, I think, applies to some extent in knitting patterns. There's so many things that the designers take for granted the knitters already know. And most knitters, or many knitters, do know it. But some people don't. Some people will go, turn? What do you mean turn? Or anything. A lot of it is just sort of nonchalantly put out there as if it's all obvious. And for a new knitter, a beginning knitter, an intimidated knitter, it may not be obvious. So I think we should consider skill inclusivity as well in this conversation. Because at the end of the day, surely all designers and everybody else would like others to have positive experiences with their knitting. And I would also suggest, and take any of this advice or leave it, but if I were a completely new knitter, I would only have one whip, one work in progress at a time, because then there's only potentially one new technique to master at a time, unless you've got one project where you're mastering the new techniques and another one to just sort of mindlessly knit on because you need a break every now and then from the new technique. But you need to be able to walk before you can run. But one thing that's motivating for you if you haven't knitted a garment before is to focus on the one project so that you will sooner have a finished object. That in itself is motivating, and then you'll know, wait, I can actually knit a sweater. And also for the first test knit that I made for Knit, which was the knobby slipover, I had coincidentally borrowed a book from the library called Strik by a Danish designer called Lene Holme Samsø, in which she goes through all sorts of techniques, and that was also helpful. So seek inspiration and knowledge anywhere. If you know people, one of my friends who knits has a neighbor who's very knowledgeable, and she goes and asks her all the time. Seek out knowledge wherever you can. That's obviously helpful. And don't be afraid to ask stupid questions. When I first started knitting the Diamond Jumper by Anne Wenzel, which was the first sweater I knitted this time round, and was the first time I knitted it for 20 years, I wrote her support people once or twice. And then when I knitted the C2 sweater by Helga Isa, I did the same. I was not too embarrassed. Well, I may have been slightly embarrassed, but they couldn't see me. So I felt that was fine. And they wrote back to me and gave me the information I needed. And then I was that much wiser. Check. You're sort of, you optimize your skill level just a tiny bit every time. And something else I would say is to begin a project that has just one strand. This one had just one strand. The Bowie had just one strand. The Sarang, of course, had two. So if it's your first sweater, it might be a good idea just to have the one strand. And somebody actually asked me a good question. Why is it that you knit with two strands in the first place? What's the reason for that? Is it required in the pattern? And I thought, oh, that's a good question. So I thought I would just try to address that. being still a relatively new knitter this second time around, I feel, moving into the intermediate, or the brave beginner, the brave intermediate knitter. Well, it's, for one thing, it's got to do with how it looks. It's got several different reasons. You will knit on a bigger needle if you have 2 strands. If I look at these two, the Bishop Bush yarns that I use for the Sarang sweater, of course, once you have 2 strands instead of maybe just this one, you will be able to use a bigger needle because the gauge will change. And the gauge is, how many stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches, which means the fabric will become that tiny bit denser and not so loose. So it's also got to do with the kind of fabric that you want. And if one of the strands is silk mohair, you will also have what is sometimes referred to as that halo. So it has a little sort of the fuzz that you can see, which I think is also connected to the whole sort of, it has a kind of a luxurious look if you have knitted something and you've held mohair with a wool of some kind or cashmere. It can also be depth. For instance, in this one, this is the pale pink. It has a little bit of like just a hint of off-white in it, but this is more nude. So the color becomes somewhere in between, which means it has more depth. Had I chosen the silk mohair that was more similar to this, it would have been more pink, but maybe the depth would have been somewhat different. So you can also play around with color that way. Let's imagine that you think this is too pink. I want to, or not pink enough. Then you can choose this one or the other pink and add more or less of a pink tone to it. So there's gauge, there's fabric, there's the halo, and then there's the whole luxurious part of it. And then there's also the fact that it becomes more durable. It's not going to feel so slouchy when you wash it and wear it because there's more durability in it. The silk mohair will add to the durability. And finally, I think there's also something like it's a trend. It's been a trend for a while. I didn't even think about it when I started knitting because the Clint Classic, which was my second sweater, it demanded it in the pattern. So I just, okay, fine. That's apparently where we are now. It certainly wasn't where we were 20-something years ago, but it's it's of the moment. I'm not sure if it's necessarily going to change again. I don't think it's going to vanish. I just think that, we're going to have other options as well. My goodness, this video is getting long. I'm just going to put on the Sarang sweater again because this is a knitting video. Okay, I also wanted to say thank you so much for all your suggestions in terms of yarns that can be worn for people who have sensitive skin like myself. I have absolutely made a note of them, and now I don't only have a knitting queue but a yarn queue, and that's going to be very interesting to work my way through. And I think I've already slightly begun. A couple of you wrote that one of the things that you do is you always wear something underneath. I always do that, no matter what type of wool it is. I think even if it's cashmere, I haven't so far found anything that I can wear next to skin, and I don't actually expect that. So that's all right. Somebody also wrote to say that for them it's gotten easier to wear wool, and one of my sweaters, the Guernsey Genser by Softness garn, became gradually easier to wear over the winter. And I do actually, even though this is knitted in a yarn, the wool here is Jensen yarn, it's a bit rustic for me. One of the things that I've done, apart from wearing stuff underneath and a little scarf around the neckline, is I've taken a shaver and shaved the inside a little so that the longest hairs would be gone. And I think one of the reasons why some of these wools will become easier to wear, when the viewer wrote that, I thought, is that because our skin gets used to it? And I don't think that's unfortunately the case. I think it's more because maybe the hairs sticking out on the inside will begin to felt together and be a little more sort of matted against the inside and not stick out so much. I don't know. At any rate, one thing I just wanted to briefly address is that some people have asked me to be friends on Facebook. And first I was like, oh, okay. And then gradually when a few more came in, I thought, first of all, I'm not at all active on Facebook, but I have previous history on Facebook and photos and stuff. And to be honest, I'm not really friends with anybody on Facebook that I don't know in real life. So I think I'm just going to pass on that. And there's nothing personal in that. It's just, I'm not really on there anyway, so it doesn't feel obvious to me. I hope that's okay. Somebody asked me what my favorite knitting needles are, and I wouldn't say I have favorite knitting needles because I just have knitting needles at this stage. But I have these. These are the ones I'm knitting the Seon kimono on. It's Knit Pro, and it's simply what I began knitting on when I started again. I also have this really lovely set of C-knit knitting needles that are bamboo, and they're a little more pointy, which is very useful for knitting in this yarn when you have two strands, so that you don't lose one of them, and also for the cables, etc. So I really like those. The Knit Pro are for interchangeable cables, and that was simply more cost efficient for a while. I would like to try the metal needles that I've seen some people use, but I think one of the reasons why I didn't use them is that from, harking back to the days when I first started knitting, the metal needles back then were sort of grayish, supermarket-like knitting needles, and I didn't enjoy knitting on them. I used bamboo back then. So now I just sort of went to my local yarn store when I began my first project and saw what they had. So I haven't been very adventurous when it comes to knitting needles, and I'll see what happens down the road. But certainly the interchangeable ones were the least expensive, the most economical for me. So far that's worked out well, and I will probably continue to do a mix of that and then the C-knit for this. Okay, moving on to the part of this video that's to do with the yarn love from New York City. And it's of course connected to the acquisition of yarn. And it's meant completely literally, yarn love from New York City. And I'll tell you why. Okay, so there are 3 installments here. If you'll remember in my last video, I talked about how there were also yarns that I would like to try that I can't get a hold of here in Denmark. And one of them was knit collage. Well, a lovely viewer, Kathy from Montana, hi Kathy, sent me a fantastic package that was sent to my hotel in New York with US Postal. I was so excited to receive a package from US Postal in which she had put a skein of this blue knit collage, Spun Cloud, I think it's called, and 3 skeins of this gorgeous gray color. Can you believe it? It was just so kind of her. So thank you so much, Kathy. And of course, I just went nuts on the Knit Collage homepage looking for patterns. And I think one of the things that I would like to do is knit a cardigan, because it looks almost like a jacket. And this is potentially a little rustic. It may not be rustic when I knit it and wash it, but I had in mind that maybe I could put a lining inside. I'm not sure, but I'm very excited to knit with this. It may be an autumn project because it's probably going to be a bit warm, but I'm very excited. I was thinking, should I knit it just using these 4 skeins, because there's absolutely yarn enough for it. But I was also wondering, should I splurge and buy just 1 skein of the Daisy chain in a blue color from Loop in London? The VAT would surely be relatively minimal. I'm not sure yet. The jury's out on that. If you have any opinions on that, let me know. But of course you don't know what cardigan I'm going to be knitting yet. But something that invites these 2 colors and is a knit collage pattern. So very excited for that. And so grateful. I couldn't believe the generosity of that. It was just astounding. The next thing was that if you've seen my New York videos, which probably you haven't because you're here for the knitting, and that's completely fine. But in my videos from New York City, I mentioned that a viewer had contacted me to ask if I wanted tickets for my family and I to go up in the Empire State Building because she worked there. And of course I said, yes, thank you. You know, again, the kindness and generosity just astounded me. So we met up in front of the Empire State Building. How often do you have a date with somebody outside the Empire State Building? And we went up in the building, and she got us through the whole security and stuff. And we saw her office, and her name is Beata, and she's from Poland originally, but she moved to New York in 1990, and she was just delightful. And she gifted me 2 things, which I love. First of all, this beautiful cowl in a lace pattern. Is that just gorgeous or what? I'm not sure what the pattern is. Beata, if you want to tell us what the pattern is, it's a lace pattern. It's really lovely, and it's in this off-white pearly silk mohair. And she also gifted me this yarn that she had spun herself, which is just lovely and soft. And I think I'm going to knit a hat with it in the autumn. So thank you so much, Beata. And then, of course, there was a tiny, I wouldn't call it haul because it wasn't very, well, I didn't buy all that much. But when I was in New York, I visited Brooklyn General Store, which was high up on my list of destinations. Not so much for my family, but there you go. And it was not only lovely to walk through Brooklyn, but somebody's cutting the grass outside. Maybe you can hear it. Anyway, I didn't dare record so much in Brooklyn General Store because I was afraid that it would offend somebody, or, you know, that they would get angry or something. I considered asking if I was allowed to record, but what if I got a no? Then I would have to delete what I had already recorded, so I decided to not do that. So I don't have very much footage from the shop. It was so lovely to be there. And the first yarn that I just immediately headed toward, I don't know why, but it was this color. It's a surrey alpaca, and it's Moondrake. It's Fuwa, Moondrake Fuwa, Cashmere Merino fingering weight, and the color is called Softness. I love this sort of sky blue soft. Oh, it's so soft, and I was just immediately drawn to it. I have no idea what I'm going to be using it for. I imagine it might be enough for just a little colorwork section in a colorwork sweater up here, but I don't have a pattern for it. I just had to have it. The second yarn that I bought, it's not very adventurous, but it's gray, and it's a yarn that somebody had recommended, and I have been eyeing it for a while. And it's this light gray in the Rerum Natura Gilliat, and it's called Brouillard. I think it means fog, and I love that. I just, every time there's a moody atmospheric name to a yarn, I'm immediately drawn to it. I was looking at this and then a light blue, but the light blue was just pure light blue. This gray to me had an undertone of blue, and so that sort of depth just drew me to it. And I know it's not very exciting, but I'm honestly very excited for this. I bought a sweater's quantity of this. I have 1 or 2 projects in mind for the fall, but I'm not sure yet exactly which one. So I'll get back to you on that once I actually get to the knitting of it. But I think it should be soft, even for me. The next thing I can't explain. I mean, the 2 colors you just saw, probably completely unsurprising if you've seen any of my previous videos. The next color, I'm not sure why. I bought 2 skeins of this Cashmerino from La Bien-Aimée in a color that I can't explain. But I was just completely drawn to this. Will you look at this color? And again here, I have to say, the name Fluoro Morganite, I was just drawn to that. It's kind of like a flamingo color. I have no idea how it's going to look on me, but I love it so much. And since it's a blend of merino, cashmere, and nylon, I think it's going to be soft enough for my skin. I was contemplating making some kind of summer knit or spring knit in this. I've already caked up the other skein. Ah, look at that. Isn't that, it's like fluorescent, and I love it, you know, neon to neutrals again. So I'm very excited about that. I've been thinking about 1 or 2 projects. The only problem is that this is fingering, and the projects I've seen and I'm drawn toward use decay weight. So I'm not sure if I should try to manipulate something. The lady in the Brooklyn General Store suggested adding a silk mohair, and I thought about that for a minute. There's a beautiful silk mohair in the same color, but then it would not be a spring knit or summer knit because it will be too warm. So I'm gonna have a think about that, and I'll get back to you. The last thing that I bought is completely also sort of, it's just one skein, and I don't know what I'm gonna be using it for yet, but of course I had to get something from Spincycle. I mean, look at that. This is called Space Oddity, and I love it so much. It's got minty greens and grays and slight flamingo color again. The lady in Brooklyn General Store actually suggested, oh, you could use these 2 in the same sweater. And yeah, you could. I'm not ruling it out, but I feel there's already so much happening with this one, in this one, that it should just be its own thing. And for me, this would be perhaps better in something where the rest of the body is gray. But of course, it's not going to be very much since I just bought the one skein. But I was afraid of, you know, just having too many skeins lying around. And maybe I should have bought 2, but they don't come cheap. Something else that was interesting when I talked to her, she was very helpful, by the way, and suggested all sorts of things. And we had a nice yarny talk, which I loved. And she said, oh yeah, you know, every time some Scandinavians come in here, there have apparently been some Danes that in the morning or the day before, they always go for the Spincycle yarns, which I can understand. We don't have that here in Denmark anywhere, as far as I know. So now I think I actually officially have a smallish stash, which is very satisfying. And I'll keep you posted in terms of what I'm going to knit with it, of course. And in the meantime, I'm going to be knitting on the Seon kimono and the snow crocus a little bit. And I'm heading into springy projects as well. I've bought one thing. I actually bought this yarn before we went to New York, but it only arrived the other day because suddenly there was a lot of demand for it. And it's 100% linen. It's this brand. I'll show you more once I actually begin knitting with it. But I bought a pattern by Natasha Hornby from Moondrake Knits, and I can't wait to knit that as well. But there will be more about that in the next video, which will probably be about spring knits or springy knits. And till then, thank you so much for spending a bit of time with me here, for listening to me rambling on about various things knitting related. Thank you for embracing me in this knitting community. I feel very grateful to be part of it, and I love that you're part of it too. And can I just maybe reiterate E.M. Forster's words, only connect? That's what we're here for. That's what it's all about. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're knitting on something that sparks joy. If you'd like to share with me what you're knitting on, I would love to hear it. If you have any more questions, anything you'd like to know or that you want to share, I'd love to hear it. And thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.